In the heart of an empire ruled by fear, one warrior defies the code to save a human life, risking everything. Now, stripped of her title and sentenced to a lifetime in the shadow cells, Ilara faces the ultimate choice: escape with the man who saved her, or fight for a future that could shatter the empire itself. As the walls close in and the alarms blare, a forbidden alliance forms, and a single act of mercy threatens to change the fate of the entire galaxy. Will Ilara and Elias break free, or will they be crushed by the unyielding power of the Zethorian Empire? Time is running out. The choice is theirs. If you're new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. The hall was silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from a lack of words, but a forced, unnatural silence. The air seemed to hold its breath as a cold, harsh light shone from above, casting long shadows that stretched across the white stone floor. The crowd in the gallery stood motionless, their hands behind their backs as if they were statues. Their faces remained expressionless, showing no sign of judgment or emotion. This, too, was part of the code. In the center of the room, standing, tall despite her chains, was Ilara. Her armor, once polished to a brilliant shine, was now cracked and burned. The scars from the battlefield marked her body, and blood trickled down from a wound above her brow. But she didn't flinch. She didn't wipe it away. Her long, dark hair was tightly pulled back, and her expression remained unreadable. She didn't dare show weakness. She had been taught from the day she was born that to be strong was to be silent. She had failed the final test. The elders, the highest judges of the Zerthian Empire, sat on their raised platform, their cold eyes fixed on her. The middle elder, an ancient figure with silver streaks in his long hair, stood and addressed the room. His voice, though quiet, echoed in the silence, every word weighing heavily in the air. "You were given a simple task," the elder said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You were told to complete the mission without question, without hesitation." He paused, his gaze narrowing. "And yet you hesitated." Ilara didn't speak. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, her body tense but still. She had learned long ago that to react was to admit defeat. Her mind raced, remembering the moments that had led her here. She had been in the midst of a dangerous mission, fighting alongside her comrades to secure a strategic position. But then she saw him, the human. He was lying there in the dirt, bleeding, afraid. She had paused, just for a moment. It was enough to change everything. The elder's voice broke through her thoughts. "You stopped to help an injured life form, a human no less, and because of that, your unit failed. 4 of your fellow cadets were captured, and the mission was lost, all because of you." Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, just a brief second of relief before the weight of his words crashed down on her. She remembered the fire, the smoke, the screams. She remembered the human man, his eyes filled with fear and pain, looking up at her as if she was his savior. He wasn't her enemy. She had saved him, even though it meant risking everything. "Do you deny your failure?" The elder's voice was sharp. "No." Ilara's voice was calm, but her words held a quiet strength. She did not need to justify herself. She had made her choice, and now she would face the consequences. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. It was brief, barely audible, but Ilara heard it. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment. They expected her to beg, to plead for mercy, but she wouldn't. The elder's cold gaze swept over her, and he turned to his fellow judges. They exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Then, "You accept the consequences," the elder said, his voice final. "I accept them," Ilara replied without hesitation. The elder nodded and turned to the others, who gave a silent nod of agreement. "Your name will be removed from the warrior scroll," the elder continued, his voice echoing in the hall. "You will no longer serve as a protector of the Zerthian order, and for your weakness, you will serve 10 cycles in the shadow cells." The sentence was harsh, but Ilara had expected it. The shadow cells were a fate worse than death, a place where the broken were sent to disappear. They were cold, dark, and isolated, and many never returned. But Alara had already made peace with her fate. She had chosen to help someone in need, and she would bear the weight of that choice. As the sentence was announced, there was no protest, no applause. The crowd remained still, their faces cold and impassive. The two guards stepped forward, each holding an electric staff, and walked toward her. Without resistance, Alara allowed them to take her arms, pulling her toward the exit. But as they moved through the crowd, something unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a figure stepped forward, a human. His name was Elias Mercer, and he had been watching the trial from the shadows. He was a biologist, a scientist who had once been taken by the Zerthians as part of a trade deal. He had been there when Alara had saved him, carrying him out of the battlefield despite the danger. She had defied her orders to help him. Now, he watched her being dragged away, punished for that very kindness. His hands clenched at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't stand by and watch this happen, not to her, not after everything she had done for him. He turned and walked out of the hall, his mind set. Alara's fate wasn't sealed yet, not if he had anything to say about it. The doors of the hall closed behind him, and the crowd continued to watch, in silence, unmoved by the actions of the humans in their midst. But deep down, something had shifted. Alara had chosen compassion over duty, and now, for the first time, someone else had made a choice to stand up for her, no matter the cost. The trial was over, but the real story was just beginning. As the doors to the Hall of Judgment slammed shut, the echo of their closing lingered in the silence. Elias Mercer stood outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen the trial, heard the judgment, and watched as Alara was dragged away in chains. But something inside him refused to let it go. It wasn't over. Not yet. Elias had always known that the Zethorians were cold, calculating, and unyielding. He had witnessed their power up close, especially when they had taken him as a prisoner in their ruthless empire. He had never thought of them as monsters. No, they were something far worse. They were machines, creatures trained to follow orders without question, and they expected the same from everyone. To them, mercy was a weakness, compassion a flaw. Alara, however, had defied that logic, choosing to help him when she could have, easily walked away. He had never forgotten that moment. Elias stood alone in the courtyard, watching as Zethorian soldiers passed by, their eyes ignoring him as if he were invisible. It was a feeling he had grown accustomed to over the years, the indifference of a species who saw humans as nothing more than pawns in their grand game. But he wasn't a pawn anymore. Not after what Alara had done for him. He knew he had to act. He had been planning his escape for weeks, studying the architecture of the Zethorian capital, mapping out the prison cells, and gathering resources. But this was different. This wasn't about his freedom. This was about hers. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the collar of his cloak, blending in with the Zethorian diplomats and officers walking past him. His human form was small compared to theirs, but his mind was sharp and his resolve was stronger than ever. He had come to the capital under the guise of a biologist, but he was no scientist anymore. He was a man on a mission, one that had nothing to do with his survival and everything to do with saving Alara. Elias knew the Zethorian prison system well. The shadow cells where Alara would be taken were not meant for prisoners. They were meant to erase them. The Empire had a way of making people disappear without a trace. It was a place where the broken were forgotten. He had seen it before. The empty eyes of those who had been stripped of everything, their identities erased as if they had never existed. But Alara wasn't like the others. She had shown him something that most people never saw in the Zethorian Empire. Kindness, compassion, a glimpse of what it meant to be human. She had given him that, even though she knew the consequences of her actions. And now, it was his turn to return the favor. He had been watching her since the trial, seeing the guards march her through the halls, dragging her to her cell. He knew where they would take her. He knew the layout of the prison, every turn, every passageway. He had studied it all. But it wasn't just the layout he had memorized. It was the faces of the guards, the routines they followed, the patterns in their behavior. He had learned the system, and now he was going to use it against them. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on. As he walked through the streets, his mind already working on the plan, something gnawed at him, something that made his skin crawl. The Zathorians weren't just going to let Alara go quietly. She had defied them in a way that no one had before. They would do everything in their power to break her. Elias had to move fast. In his quarters, Elias began to gather the items he had collected for his plan. A stolen access card, a mini drone, a cloak with signal-dampening fibers, and a map of the prison levels, everything he needed to infiltrate the heart of Zethor's security. He had been careful, patient, but now the time had come. The guards who would be assigned to Alara's cell wouldn't expect a thing. He would slip in, disable the security systems, and free her before anyone knew he was there. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't expecting anyone. He had been careful to stay under the radar, blending in with the others, but the Zathorians weren't known for their subtlety. Was someone onto him? Was this the end before he had even started? The knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. Elias moved quickly, walking over to the door and peering through the small viewport. To his surprise, it was not a Zathorian soldier standing outside. Instead, it was a woman, a human. Her clothes were simple, but there was something familiar about her. It took him a moment, but then he recognized her. It was Mira, a fellow diplomat who had arrived on the Zathorian ship with him. She had always been quiet, keeping to herself, but Elias had never suspected she was more than just another human trapped in the Zathorian system. She glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was watching, before whispering through the door. "They're watching you, Elias. You're not the only one who wants to see her free." Elias's heart skipped a beat. Mira wasn't just any diplomat. She was part of a secret resistance, a group of humans and Zathorians working together to undermine the Empire. They had been waiting for someone like Alara, the one who would spark a revolution, who would lead them to freedom. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed someone who understood the system, someone who had the courage to fight back. Mira's eyes were serious, but there was a spark of hope in them. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "We've been watching you, and we know what you're planning." Elias felt a surge of determination. He had always believed that he was just a bystander, an observer in the grand scheme of things. But now, with Mira standing before him, he realized that he wasn't alone. They were all in this together, and together they could change everything. "I'm not leaving without her," Elias said, his voice steady. Mira nodded, her expression grim. "Then we'll help you. But you have to move quickly. The Zathorians won't wait forever." The words hung in the air as Elias prepared himself for what was coming. He had a plan. But now, with Mira's help, it wasn't just his plan anymore, it was theirs. And nothing, not even the Zathorian Empire, could stop them from breaking the chains. The cold air of the prison halls hit Elias like a slap to the face as he made his way through the dark corridors. Every step echoed, though he did his best to remain as quiet as possible. He had memorized the layout of the prison, but the real challenge was staying out of sight. The Zathorians had eyes everywhere, and Elias couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. He glanced down at the map, which he had memorized over the past few days, and checked his wristband for the time. He had exactly 2 hours before the shift change. It was a small window of opportunity, but it was the only chance he had. Behind him, Mira's footsteps were light, barely making a sound, but Elias still felt the weight of every moment. They had made it this far, but Alara was still locked away deep within the prison's heart. The shadow cells where she was being held were some of the most heavily guarded rooms in the entire empire. If they failed, there was no telling what would happen to her, or to them. They reached a narrow hallway where the lights flickered overhead. Elias held his breath, listening for the sound of guards, but the hallway was empty. This was the moment. Mira looked at him with a nod of encouragement, but Elias couldn't help the knot in his stomach. There was no turning back now. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the stolen access card. The card was supposed to give him the ability to bypass the security gates, but he had never used one of these before. His hand shook slightly as he slid the card into the terminal, the lights above flickering once again as the door ahead slowly opened with a low, grinding noise. "Stay close," Elias whispered to Mira. They stepped inside the room and the door shut silently behind them. The room was dark, with only the glow of the terminal casting a faint light across the walls. It was a storage area filled with old equipment and forgotten tools, but most importantly, it was the gateway to the section of the prison where Alara was being held. Elias moved quickly to a panel on the far wall, his mind racing as he scanned the interface. The controls were simple enough to understand, but he had to be careful. One wrong move and the alarms would go off, sealing their fate. "Just a few more seconds," he muttered under his breath as he worked. Mira was watching the door, her eyes sharp, scanning every corner of the room for any sign of trouble. The silence was unbearable, every moment stretching longer than the last. Elias felt his pulse racing, each beat seeming to pound louder in his ears. Finally, there was a soft beep, and the door to the next section of the prison clicked open. "Got it," Elias said, his voice low but filled with relief. They stepped into the next hallway, which was quieter than the last. The walls were lined with thick metal doors, each one more secure than the last. But they weren't looking for just any cell. They were looking for Alara. Elias led the way, his heart pounding as they passed row after row of cells. He knew Alara was close. She had to be. He had seen the map, and he knew the layout. They just had to move quickly before anyone realized. They were there. The hallway grew darker as they approached the deeper sections of the prison. The air grew colder too, and Elias could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. This was no ordinary prison. This was where the Zithorians sent their most dangerous prisoners, those who had failed the Empire, those who were meant to disappear. When they reached the final door, Elias could see the faint glow of a control panel next to it. He hurried to the panel and inserted the access card. There was a brief moment of silence before the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside the cell, Alara sat on the cold floor, her back pressed against the wall. Her eyes were closed, but as the door opened, she snapped her head up, her eyes immediately locking onto Elias. "Elias," she whispered, her voice hoarse but full of surprise. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. All he could do was walk toward her and kneel beside her. For a moment they just looked at each other, both of them exhausted and broken from the events that had led them here. The silence in the room was heavy, but there was something else in it too. Hope. "Alara," Elias finally said, his voice soft. "I came to get you. We're leaving." Alara's eyes filled with disbelief, and for a moment Elias thought she might question him. But then she looked around at the dark, cold walls of her cell, the same walls that had kept her trapped for days, and something in her shifted. Her eyes hardened with determination. "You really came for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded. "I'm not leaving without you." He pulled out the small control band from his pocket and handed it to her. "This will release the restraints," he said, his voice steady. "We've got to move quickly. We don't have much time." Alara reached out and took the band, but she didn't move immediately. She just stared at it for a long moment, as if trying to process the reality of the situation. Then, with a quick motion, she activated the band. Her restraints fell away and she stood, wincing slightly from the stiffness in her limbs. "Let's go," Elias urged, standing up and offering his hand to her. Alara hesitated for a moment, then took his hand, a sense of resolve settling over her. They moved together through the dark prison halls, each step taken with a quiet urgency. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick walls, but Elias knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. He could feel the weight of the mission growing heavier with each passing second. As they rounded a corner, Elias paused, listening for any signs of movement. The hall was empty. They had made it so far, but the hardest part was still ahead. The escape. "We need to make it to the skimmer," Elias said, his voice urgent. "We'll take it out of here, but we have to hurry." Ilara nodded, her eyes scanning the hallway. "Lead the way." Together, they moved swiftly through the prison, avoiding the patrols and using the shadows to their advantage. The skimmer was waiting for them in the hangar, but they still had a long way to go before they were free. The alarms would go off soon. They had to make it out before that happened. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in days, Ilara felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone. Elias was with her, and together, they had a chance. But as they approached the final exit, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were only just beginning. The cold wind bit at their skin as Elias and Ilara made their way through the final stretch of the prison's underground tunnels. They had reached the last corridor, and ahead, they could see the faint glow of the hangar's exit. It wasn't much further now. The skimmer was waiting, but they had to move quickly. Every second felt like an eternity, the distant echo of footsteps in the halls reminding them of how close they were to being caught. Elias's heart raced as he led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness ahead. He had never been more aware of the dangers surrounding them. The alarms would go off at any moment. The Zathorians wouldn't let them slip away so easily. He could hear the faint hum of distant patrol drones, their searchlights sweeping through the corridors. It wouldn't take long before they found out what had happened, and by then it would be too late. "Ilara, stay close," Elias whispered, his voice urgent. "We're almost there." Ilara's face was pale, her body battered from days in the shadow cells. But there was something else in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Determination. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore, she was free. At least, that's what she hoped. As they reached the end of the hallway, they saw the open doors of the hangar. The skimmer sat there looking small and battered, its metal frame covered in rust and scratches. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them out of there. "We need to hurry," Elias said, his voice tight with anxiety. "The skimmer can barely hold together as it is." Ilara nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had been trained to follow orders without question, to be cold and unfeeling, and for the first time she was allowing herself to feel something else. Fear, guilt, hope. Everything she had been taught to suppress was bubbling to the surface, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. As they approached the skimmer, the sound of sirens began to blare in the distance, their high-pitched wail cutting through the air. The Zathorians had discovered their escape. Elias's heart sank. It was too late. They were out of time. "We're running out of options," he said, his breath quickening. "Ilara, we need to go now." Ilara's eyes darted to the ship, then back to the darkening corridor behind them. The guards would be on them in seconds, but as her eyes lingered on the skimmer, something inside her shifted. She realized something she hadn't fully understood before. She had spent her whole life following orders, never questioning, always obeying the Zathorian code. It had brought her to this moment, the moment when she was being forced to run, to escape from the very empire she had sworn to serve. But now she saw the truth. The code, the empire, all of it. It had never truly cared for her. It had never cared for anyone, not really. The choice had always been hers. She could run, hide, and escape with Elias. But what would that mean? Would she be free, or would she simply be trading one prison for another? She turned to Elias, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "What if we can't outrun them?" she asked quietly. "What if the Empire finds us?" Elias's eyes met hers, and in that moment, he understood her fear. It wasn't just the fear of getting caught. It was the fear of losing herself in a world where there was no clear path forward, no certainty of what would come next. "We can't outrun them forever," Elias said, his voice calm but resolute. But we don't have to. We just have to make sure they know that we won't be controlled anymore. Alara looked at him, her heart beating faster. She had always believed in the Empire, in the code, but now she realized that the real freedom came not from escaping, but from choosing to stand for something different, something better. Elias stepped forward, taking her hand. "We can't change everything at once," he said, his eyes filled with the same determination. "But we can start by choosing to change ourselves. We've already broken the chains, Alara. Now we need to make sure the rest of the world knows that." A silence settled between them, thick with the weight of the decision. The choice was hers. They could take the skimmer and run, live as fugitives for the rest of their lives, or they could stay and fight. Fight for the freedom they had both been denied, for a world that wasn't ruled by fear and obedience. For a moment, Alara hesitated. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, the fear of the unknown pressing against her chest. But then she looked at Elias standing there beside her, his eyes filled with unwavering confidence. He had come for her, risked everything for her, and now it was her turn to choose. "I can't keep running," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's time to fight." Elias's face softened with a smile. "Then we'll fight together." Together, they turned away from the skimmer and walked toward the control center at the heart of the citadel. The alarms blared louder, now echoing through the hallways, but Alara didn't care. The walls that had once felt so imposing now seemed fragile, like they could be shattered by the very choice she had made. They reached the core of the citadel, a massive room filled with machinery, a web of lights and wires that pulsed with power. Alara knew what she had to do. She had to rewrite the code. The very code that had defined everything she had ever known. Elias stood by her side, a steady presence in the chaos. "Whatever happens, we face it together," he said. Alara stepped forward, her hand reaching for the central console. The machines hummed to life as her fingers brushed the keys. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, but she knew it was the right one. This wasn't just about escaping. This was about changing the world, and as she activated the console, the citadel seemed to shudder, as if the Empire itself was holding its breath. The walls vibrated with the power of a choice made, a choice to defy the code. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Alara felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Hope. They had made their choice, and together, they would see it through.